The tow truck's hydraulics whined in the crisp morning air as Karen Westfield stood with her arms crossed, watching the military-grade tractor being hauled away from Colonel James Harrison's driveway. A victorious smile spread across her face as she snapped a photo with her phone, already mentally composing the email she would send to the entire Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. "That's it. Make sure you get it completely off the property," Karen instructed the tow truck operator, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Section 12, paragraph 3 of our bylaws clearly states, "No commercial or agricultural equipment visible from the street." The tow truck driver glanced at the U.S. Army insignia on the side of the vehicle. "Ma'am, are you absolutely certain about this? This appears to be military property." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Rules are rules. Colonel Harrison has had 3 written warnings. I don't care if he works at Fort Braxton. This isn't a military base. It's a respectable neighborhood with standards." What Karen didn't know was that Melissa Chen, the neighborhood's newest resident, was capturing the entire incident on her phone from behind her living room curtains. As the president of the Whispering Pines HOA, Karen had already made Melissa's life miserable over the wind chimes that were 2 inches longer than permitted and a bird feeder that was encouraging non-native species. Colonel Harrison was away on a training exercise scheduled to return that afternoon. The tractor, officially classified as a multi-terrain loader, had been temporarily parked in his driveway as part of an approved military equipment testing program for civilian applications. Karen marched back to her immaculate colonial home at the end of the cul-de-sac, already drafting a community-wide announcement about her latest victory against neighborhood eyesores. As the HOA president for 5 consecutive terms, she ruled Whispering Pines with meticulous attention to every infraction, real or imagined. Inside her pristine home office, Karen updated her spreadsheet of violations. Her husband Richard had long ago stopped questioning her obsession, finding peace in his woodworking shed, which Karen had unsuccessfully tried to have classified as an unauthorized structure 3 years earlier. "Richard," she called out, "I finally resolved the Harrison situation. The hideous tractor is gone." Richard appeared in the doorway, sawdust clinging to his shirt. "Karen, are you sure that was wise? James is a full colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers. That equipment might be." "It doesn't matter who he is," Karen interrupted. "The bylaws apply to everyone equally. If we make one exception, soon this neighborhood will look like some kind of industrial zone." As Karen printed violation notices for 3 other homeowners, her phone buzzed with a text from Diane, the HOA treasurer. "Emergency situation. Colonel Harrison just called the management company. That tractor is registered to the U.S. Army and was here on official business. We could be in serious trouble." Karen's fingers froze over her keyboard. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number for the towing company. This was merely a misunderstanding that she could fix before it escalated. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hank's Towing." "Yes, this is Karen Westfield, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. There seems to have been a small misunderstanding with the vehicle we had removed this morning from Oakwood Drive." "No misunderstanding, ma'am. Your paperwork was very specific." Karen paced across her immaculate kitchen. "I need that vehicle returned immediately." "Can't do that. It's already been logged into the military impound lot. They sent their own transport once they confirmed it was their property. You'll need to talk to Fort Braxton directly." The line went dead. Karen stared at her phone in disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. In Whispering Pines, her word was practically law. Richard appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his face. "What's happening?" "Nothing I can't handle," Karen snapped, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She grabbed her HOA binder, flipping frantically to the section on military exceptions. There were none. Melissa Chen watched from her front porch as Karen power walked down the street, phone pressed to her ear. Having lived in Whispering Pines for only 3 months, Melissa had already compiled a digital folder labeled Karen's Tyranny, filled with emails demanding she replace her culturally inappropriate garden gnomes and remove the excessive potted plants from her porch. Karen's next call was to the HOA's attorney, who listened quietly before sighing heavily. "Let me understand this correctly," he said. "You authorized the towing of U.S. military equipment that was legally parked in the driveway of an active-duty colonel." "It violated our bylaws," Karen insisted. "The rules clearly state. The rules don't supersede federal property laws, Mrs. Westfield. My advice is to issue an immediate apology to Colonel Harrison and hope he doesn't pursue this further." Karen ended the call, fuming. Apologize? In 5 years as HOA president, she had never once admitted wrongdoing. Her perfect record of enforcement was her proudest achievement. As she turned the corner toward her home, she spotted an unfamiliar black SUV parked in her driveway. A woman in a crisp military uniform stood beside it, checking something on a tablet. "Excuse me," Karen called out, quickening her pace. This is private property. The woman looked up. Captain Rodriguez, Judge Advocate General's office. Are you Karen Westfield? I am. What is this regarding? I'm here about the unauthorized seizure of military property from Colonel Harrison's residence this morning. We need to discuss potential violations of federal law. Karen's stomach tightened. There must be some mistake. I was simply enforcing our community standards. Captain Rodriguez's expression remained neutral. Ma'am, you authorized the removal of equipment currently engaged in a classified testing program. Colonel Harrison had all the proper documentation and approvals. He never showed me any documentation, Karen protested, her voice rising slightly. He wasn't required to. A captain handed Karen a formal-looking envelope. This is a notice of intent to investigate. We'll need copies of all your HOA bylaws, communication records, and authorization forms. As Captain Rodriguez returned to her vehicle, Karen spotted Diane and 3 other board members huddled at the end of her driveway, whispering among themselves. The emergency HOA board meeting in Karen's dining room crackled with tension. 5 board members sat around her cherished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed anger. This is completely overblown, Karen insisted, arranging her notes with precise movements. Once I explain our procedures to the military, they'll understand we were simply maintaining community standards. Diane, the treasurer, cleared her throat. Karen, the community Facebook page has exploded. Melissa Chen posted a video of the towing. It has over 300 comments already, and none of them are supportive. Melissa Chen has been a problem since she moved in, Karen dismissed with a wave. This will all blow over once. Colonel Harrison just pulled into his driveway, interrupted Greg, the vice president, who was peering through the plantation blinds, and he's with someone in uniform. Karen fought to maintain her composure. Let them come to us through proper channels. Now, regarding our response, Karen. Richard's voice was uncharacteristically firm as he entered the dining room. Colonel Harrison and a military police officer are at our front door. They're asking to speak with you specifically. The board members exchanged glances. Karen smoothed her cashmere sweater and straightened her pearl necklace. I'll handle this, she announced, though her confidence had developed hairline fractures. Colonel Harrison stood on her front porch, still in his camouflage uniform. Beside him was a stern-faced military police officer holding a folder. Mrs. Westfield, the colonel said without extending his hand. I believe you've got something to explain. Karen adopted the tone she used when addressing landscapers who planted non-approved flowers. Colonel, while we respect your service, our homeowners association has clear rules about commercial equipment. The proper procedure would have been to request a variance before. Mrs. Westfield, the colonel interrupted, that vehicle is part of a joint engineering project between the Army Corps and FEMA for rapid deployment disaster response. Its placement was coordinated with local authorities 2 weeks ago. The officer handed Karen a document. This is the municipal approval copied to your HOA management company on March 14th. We have confirmation it was delivered. Karen scanned the paper, recognition dawning. She had indeed received this notice but had dismissed it without reading it fully, assuming it was routine correspondence. There appears to have been a miscommunication, she conceded, though the words felt foreign in her mouth. Interference with military operations is a serious matter, the colonel continued. However, I'm willing to resolve this at the community level if the vehicle is returned immediately and all towing costs are reimbursed by the HOA. Behind Karen, the dining room window blinds twitched as the board members strained to hear the conversation. I'll need to consult with our board before committing to any financial. Karen. Diane suddenly appeared beside her. Of course we'll cover all costs. The HOA takes full responsibility. She handed the colonel a business card. I'm the treasurer. Send all invoices directly to me. Colonel Harrison nodded. I expect the full reimbursement and a formal apology by end of day tomorrow. As they walked away, Karen turned to Diane, seething. You had no authority to make that commitment without board approval. Actually, Greg said from the doorway, we just voted. 5-1 in favor of immediate reimbursement and a formal apology. You're the one. Karen's world tilted slightly. You held a vote without the president present? The emergency action provision, Article 4, Greg replied calmly. Maybe review the bylaws you're so fond of quoting. The Whispering Pines Community Center buzzed with more residents than Karen had ever seen at an HOA meeting. Every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls. Whispers ceased as Karen approached the podium, the weight of dozens of stares pressing down on her. Before we begin our regular agenda, Karen said, her voice tight but controlled, I'd like to address the recent incident involving Colonel Harrison's property. From the corner of her eyes, she caught Greg and Diane exchanging glances. The board had insisted she read from the prepared statement they drafted, but Karen had other plans. While there was an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding military equipment, she continued, carefully avoiding the word apology, we must remember that our bylaws exist to maintain property values and community standards. Perhaps this incident highlights the need for clearer communication, but not for relaxing our vigilance. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Colonel Harrison, seated in the front row, crossed his arms. Melissa Chen stood up without being recognized. Excuse me, but that doesn't sound like the apology the board promised. Karen gripped the podium. Ms. Chen, we follow proper procedure here. You'll need to wait to be recognized before speaking. Like you waited for proper procedure before telling government property? Someone called from the back. Laughter followed. Karen's cheeks flushed. Order, please. As I was saying. Karen. Greg's voice cut through as he approached the podium. May I speak with you for a moment? He leaned in, whispering urgently. This isn't what we agreed to. The military is serious about this. If we don't resolve it properly, they could take legal action against the HOA and potentially you personally. I'm handling it, Karen hissed back. A commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Captain Rodriguez from the JAG office entered, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. She nodded to Colonel Harrison before taking a seat in the back. Greg returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, as vice president of the board, I need to temporarily take over this portion of the meeting. He slid a paper in front of Karen. This is the statement approved by the board. Karen stared at the paper, then at the roomful of neighbors she'd spent years monitoring, fining, and controlling. Some looked angry, others curious, a few even seemed to pity her. Richard, seated near the back, gave her an encouraging nod. With stiff movements, Karen began reading the approved statement. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association deeply regrets the unauthorized removal of U.S. Army property from Colonel Harrison's residence. As HOA president, I take full responsibility for this error in judgment and for failing to properly review the documentation that had been provided. Each word felt like gravel in her mouth, but she continued. We have fully reimbursed all expenses related to the recovery of the equipment and are reviewing our procedures to ensure this never happens again. On behalf of the board and myself personally, I extend our sincere apologies to Colonel Harrison and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. When she finished, the room remained silent for a long moment before Colonel Harrison stood. Apology accepted, he said simply. I appreciate the HOA taking responsibility. Now I have a proposal for the board regarding future military-civilian cooperation in this community that might benefit everyone. As the colonel outlined a community preparedness program that would bring positive attention to Whispering Pines, Karen slipped into a chair, watching her carefully constructed kingdom begin to transform before her eyes. Karen's morning routine had always been precise. Coffee at 6:30 a.m., neighborhood patrol at 7:15, documenting violations by 8 o'clock. But today she lingered at her kitchen window, coffee growing cold in her hand. Across the street, Colonel Harrison was speaking with Melissa Chen and several other neighbors, all gathered around what appeared to be architectural plans spread across the hood of his car. They're planning something, Karen muttered to Richard, who was preparing his lunch for work. Richard glanced out the window. Looks like that community preparedness program the colonel mentioned. Diane texted you about the planning committee yesterday. Without consulting me first, I'm still the president. Richard closed his lunch container with a decisive click. Maybe it's time to take a step back, Karen. You've been running yourself ragged over this neighborhood for years. Because nobody else cares about standards, Karen snapped, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. After Richard left for work, Karen found herself drawn to her home office, where 5 years of meticulously organized HOA records filled a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. She pulled out a binder labeled Violations 2023 to 2024 and flipped through pages of photos. Garbage cans left out too long, unapproved paint colors, holiday decorations that exceeded size limitations. The doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she was surprised to see Melissa Chen. Karen opened the door just wide enough to create a barrier. Yes? Melissa smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Good morning, Karen. I'm collecting signatures for the Community Preparedness Initiative. The Colonel has arranged for Whispering Pines to be a pilot location for FEMA's new Neighborhood Resilience Program. She held out a clipboard with a sheet already filled with signatures. We need the board's approval, of course, but we wanted to show community support first. Karen recognized nearly every name in the neighborhood, including all her board members. This should have come through proper channels. The board needs to review any proposals before the general membership. Melissa's smile tightened. Actually, we checked the bylaws. Article 7, Section 3 allows members to petition for special project consideration with signatures from 2/3 of homeowners. Karen felt a familiar surge of indignation, but it was now tinged with something unfamiliar, doubt. I'll need to verify this, she said, making no move to sign. Of course, Melissa replied smoothly. By the way, the colonel mentioned you might be interested in seeing the equipment demonstration this afternoon. The same type of tractor you had touted will be on display along with other emergency response vehicles. The casual reference to Karen's most humiliating moment stung. I have prior commitments. That's too bad. The media will be there. Local news is covering it as a positive community story. After Melissa left, Karen found herself drawn back to the window. More neighbors had gathered around the colonel, including elderly Mrs. Abernathy, who had once tearfully complied with Karen's demand to remove a memorial bench for her late husband because it wasn't on the approved garden furniture list. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Planning meeting at 1 p.m. at Community Center for Female Program. Your input would be valuable, especially regarding bylaw compliance. The olive branch was thinly disguised, but it was there nonetheless. Karen stared at her violation binders, then back at her neighbors across the street. Colonel Harrison was now helping Mrs. Abernathy examine the plans, his hand supportively on her shoulder. For the first time in years, Karen felt something shift inside her. A recognition that perhaps there were different ways to build a community than through rigid enforcement and constant vigilance. The community center parking lot had been transformed. Military vehicles, including the now infamous tractor, were positioned in neat rows. Uniformed personnel explained equipment features to excited residents, while a FEMA representative handed out emergency preparedness kits. A news van from Channel 7 had set up near the entrance, a reporter preparing for a live broadcast. Karen sat in her car across the street, observing the scene with mixed emotions. She hadn't planned to come, but here she was, drawn by both curiosity and a nagging sense that her absence would only cement her status as the neighborhood villain. "You can do this," she whispered to herself before stepping out of her car. As she approached, conversations faltered and several heads turned in her direction. Karen lifted her chin and continued walking. Colonel Harrison spotted her first, excusing himself from a group of neighbors to meet her halfway. "Mrs. Westfield, I'm glad you could join us." Karen nodded stiffly. "I thought it prudent to see what changes are being proposed for our community." "Not changes," the colonel corrected gently. "Enhancements. Whispering Pines has been selected as a model community for disaster resilience because of its excellent infrastructure and engaged residents." Despite herself, Karen felt a flicker of pride. The excellence of Whispering Pines had always been her mission, even if her methods had made her unpopular. "The multi-terrain loader you're familiar with," he continued, gesturing toward the tractor, "is designed to clear debris after storms, dig emergency trenches for flooding, and even assist with snow removal. We're offering training to select community members." "That sounds beneficial," Karen admitted. As they walked through the display, Karen noticed Diane waving from near the community center doors. The treasurer approached, her expression cautiously optimistic. "Karen, we're discussing how to integrate the program with our existing emergency protocols. Your input would be valuable." Inside, the board members and several residents were gathered around a conference table covered with maps and documents. The conversation paused momentarily as Karen entered, then resumed with deliberate normalcy. Greg was explaining a point about communication systems. The satellite backup would ensure we maintain contact even if cell towers are down. Karen listened attentively, then raised her hands slightly. "Our current emergency contact system is outdated. We've been using phone trees, but that's vulnerable to power outages." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to find fault, but Karen continued. "This satellite system would be a significant improvement. I support it." Subtle glances of surprise passed between board members. As the meeting progressed, Karen found herself contributing constructively, her extensive knowledge of the community's infrastructure proving unexpectedly valuable. When discussion turned to funding, she even identified a reserve allocation that could help cover costs without raising dues. After the meeting, as residents filtered out to rejoin the exhibition, Colonel Harrison approached Karen again. "Mrs. Westfield, you've clearly put tremendous thought into this community's well-being over the years." Karen blinked, unused to having her intentions acknowledged rather than her methods criticized. "The program needs a detail-oriented coordinator," he continued, "someone who knows the neighborhood inside and out. Would you consider taking on that role? It would work alongside your HOA duties, not replace them." Before Karen could respond, Melissa Chen approached, camera in hand. "Colonel, the news crew wants some footage of you with the equipment." She nodded politely to Karen. "Mrs. Westfield, they'd like to interview board members too. Would you be willing?" Karen hesitated, imagining herself trying to explain the towing incident on local television. But the reporter was already heading their way, microphone extended. "Mrs. Westfield, I'm Sarah Chen from Channel 7 News," the reporter said, positioning her microphone. "Can you tell us about Whispering Pines being selected for this military-civilian partnership?" The camera's red light blinked on. Karen felt a momentary panic, then took a deep breath. After years of composing strongly worded violation notices, she knew the power of choosing her words carefully. "Whispering Pines has always prioritized community standards," she began, surprising herself with her steady voice. This partnership with Colonel Harrison and FEMA represents an evolution of those priorities. We're now focusing on safety and resilience, not just aesthetics. The reporter looked intrigued by this unexpected angle. I understand there was some initial confusion about military equipment in the neighborhood. Karen felt Colonel Harrison tense beside her, but she didn't hesitate. Yes, there was. I made a mistake by having equipment towed without proper investigation. It was a valuable lesson about the importance of communication over strict enforcement. Off camera, Diane's eyebrows shot up in surprise. The reporter smiled. And how has the community responded to this new initiative? With enthusiasm, Karen answered, gesturing toward the residents examining the equipment. Whispering Pines has always been strong on rules and structure. Now we're channeling that organization toward emergency preparedness. After the interview, Colonel Harrison studied her with newfound respect. That was gracious, Mrs. Westfield. Karen, she corrected him, and it was honest. About your offer, I'd like to learn more. As they discussed the coordinator position, Richard appeared at the edge of the crowd, watching his wife with a surprised smile. When she noticed him, he gave her a thumbs up. Later that evening, Karen sat at her dining room table with a fresh notebook, mapping out ideas for integrating the preparedness program with existing HOA structures. The doorbell rang twice in quick succession, Diane's signature ring. The treasurer stood on the porch holding a folder and wearing an expression of cautious optimism. I brought the preliminary budget for the program. Do you have a minute? Over coffee, the two women reviewed figures and timelines, their usual tension gradually giving way to productive collaboration. When Richard brought them fresh coffee, he found them hunched over a community map discussing emergency assembly points. The North Park makes sense logistically, Karen was saying, but the west entrance has better vehicle access. What about both? Diane suggested, different gathering points depending on the type of emergency. Karen nodded appreciatively. That's smart. We could code them in the emergency manuals. After Diane left, Richard sat beside his wife. I haven't seen you this engaged in a long time. Karen closed her notebook, considering, I've been thinking about what the Colonel said about channeling my organizational skills differently. She hesitated. Have I been too rigid, Richard? Be honest. Richard took her hand. You always wanted the best for this community, but sometimes the rules became more important than the people they were meant to serve. Instead of her usual defensiveness, Karen felt a weight lifting. I'm not sure everyone will forgive the bench incident, or the Christmas lights violations, or the Garden Gnome crusade. Richard laughed. Maybe not overnight, but people respond to sincerity, and you've made a good start today. Karen thought about Mrs. Abernethy's face when the Colonel had supported her suggestion about emergency buddy systems for elderly residents. The same woman whose memorial bench Karen had once deemed non-conforming had valuable insights that the community needed. For the first time in years, Karen fell asleep without mentally cataloging neighborhood violations. Instead, her mind filled with possibilities for a different kind of community leadership, one that built connections rather than enforced divisions.